reason for this meeting is in light of the Supreme Court ruling a few weeks ago, which, outright transphobic and just explicitly saying trans women are not women. But I think I want to start with a bit of the wider context of transphobia in Britain. I think we've seen with the rise of the far right, gender ideology has been sort of a central feature of the culture war, portraying sort of trans people as dangerous, that we're indoctrinating kids into some sort of cult, that trans women are predatory men trying to get into women's bathrooms, trans men are mentally ill young girls who are mutilating themselves. And I think this has been a central feature of the sort of rise of the far right, and it fits very well, obviously, into the rest of their rhetoric of sort of racist and misogynistic talking points. And I think, obviously, Donald Trump being a sort of driving figure in that. But I think we've also seen very similar talking points in Britain as well, with probably more of an emphasis on the sort of radical feminist, gender-critical people who are very concerned about attacks on women's rights just by trans people existing. But I think it's also not just the far right that have been attacking trans people recently. Over the last few years, we've seen increasing attacks from first the Tories and then continued by the Labour Party. There are obviously lots of examples that I could give, but in 2023, the Tories, in a historic first, blocked the Scottish reform to the Gender Recognition Act. There was a sort of proposed guidance for teachers and schools which said nobody should be expected to use a child's preferred pronouns. And said they wanted a parent-first approach. So, if a child says anything about thinking about their gender, the immediate course of action is to tell their parents, as if they've done something wrong, right? And then, of course, last year there was the cash report, which I won't go into too much detail of, but effectively is trying to undermine trans healthcare in Britain. It was focused around reviewing the services for under 18s, but it also said that up to, I think it was 21-year-olds should be included in children's services, and saying that there's no sort of scientific basis for trans healthcare. And unfortunately, this faced very little backlash in Britain. It was generally accepted. It was treated as sort of reasonable, scientific. It's about looking after children, and we have to, make sure we're not letting children make mistakes or do things that they don't understand. And so following that, there was then the ban on puberty blockers. The amount of children who were taking puberty blockers at the time that it was banned was like less than 100. They were already incredibly hard to get, and obviously this is a political decision, right? It's devastating to those children who were no longer able to take puberty blockers. But actually, cisgender children are still allowed to take the exact same medicine. So how can it possibly be about the safety of the medicine? And obviously the context of these attacks is a healthcare system for trans people that is already completely failing. The waiting lists are years long, and many trans people find it incredibly difficult even to just get referred onto the waiting list. I don't want to just list a load of depressing statistics at you, but I think I'm going to say one because I think it really emphasizes the horrifying reality of what it's like to be a trans person in Britain at the minute, which is that 92% of trans young people have considered taking their own life, and 45% have tried to take their own life. Obviously that's a horrific statistic. And I think, it really emphasizes how hostile the environment in Britain has been to trans people. And it is within that context that this Supreme Court ruling has come out, which is a direct escalation in the attacks on trans people. And I think it's really important to understand the sort of ideological shift that has gone on to say, they've sort of dropped the mask, right? It's not about children. It's not about, making sure that they're really definitely trans. They're just saying categorically trans people are wrong. Trans people do not know what their gender is. Trans women are not women, and trans men are not men. And I think it's really important to understand the sort of severity of that and the weight that that gives to the sort of cultural situation in the country. That is now an entirely legitimate position to hold, right? That is the position under UK law, is that trans people are just wrong. So in the light of that ruling, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission have produced their interim update of the implications, and explicitly saying that all trans people should be entirely excluded from any single-sex spaces. And specifically talking about bathrooms, they specifically make sure to talk about bathrooms in schools, just so you know that you should definitely exclude trans kids. And saying that this should be the policy that people are working under in any services open to the public, in schools, in workplaces. So, and of course that doesn't mean that they click their fingers and write this guidance and suddenly no trans people can use bathrooms, but it does set the tone for what is expected and what the battles are going to be over the coming months and years, as we have to fight in every workplace and in every situation to defend the rights that trans people already had. I think the media response to this has also been incredibly difficult to watch. I think there's been a massive focus on celebration by women's rights activists, that this was how the news was broken, that it was celebrating this victory. I think some of the headlines have been absolutely horrifying. There was one in the Telegraph that said, "Nothing captures the madness of our times better than the trans ruling hysteria," next to a picture of a trans rights demo. And finally we're screening trans children for autism, but let's not swap one mania for another. So clearly the mainstream media has seen this ruling and jumped on the opportunity to legitimize all of their bigotry. They no longer need to be subtle. They can simply outright say that they do not like trans people. And this is sort of entirely reasonable, backed up by, of course, the Labour government, with Starmer coming out saying that the ruling provides clarity. And a Labour MP on the news explicitly saying that this problem is because of the Tories, because the Tories once said that trans women were women. So, when the Labour Party are claiming that the Tories were too progressive, and this is why we have all of these problems, I think we can tell that something's gone wrong. And so it is, entirely legitimate to sort of hold these positions. And of course, it's not just the sort of what is now this sort of moderate concerns, it also emboldens the far right. It emboldens people to harass trans people, and also anyone who they think could be trans, right? Despite what these transphobes seem to think, you cannot actually tell by looking at someone whether they're trans. So anyone who does not fit into their perfect box of what a woman should look like and what a man should look like is going to find it increasingly difficult just to exist in the world, right? And of course, this is part of the broader political context, the rise of the far right and the Labour Party, failing to offer anything to ordinary people, doubling down on their racism, on their support for genocide, cutting disability benefits, and now attacking trans people. I realise I spent a very long time painting a very grim picture of what it's like, but I think it is important to try and get across how serious the situation is. But of course, that is only one side of the story, right? In response to the ruling, thousands of people have come out onto the streets against it. There were 30,000 people on the demo in London, and the atmosphere was absolutely electric. It was incredible to be there. And that was at 3 days' notice. There were 30,000 people. There were thousands of people up and down the country, in all sorts of different places, coming out. And I think it's really clear to see that there is a sense of anger at this ruling, and people do want to fight back. So I will come back to how we can fight back, but I guess I wanted a bit to offer sort of an explanation on the nature of transphobia, because it's not just that, the people at the top of society woke up one day and said, maybe we should start hating trans people now, or that bigots just sort of choose a random person, right? As I've explained, this is pushed by the state, it's reinforced. But also, I think a key to understanding it is understanding the role that the family plays under capitalism. The family is a key tool for the ruling class. It has immense economic value in the sense of the amount of unpaid labour that is done in the home, predominantly by women, is absolutely crucial to the capitalist economy to keep running, right? And it also provides a ideological role in that it allows you to train up your next generation of workers with all of the ideas that you want them to have, reinforcing that this is the way you're supposed to exist in society, reinforcing the types of lives that you're supposed to live. And crucially, LGBT people are a threat to this. We do not fit into their neat box of what a nuclear family should look like. It's worth noticing that there is some flexibility in the ruling class's use of the family. Of course, now it is not so explicit that every woman should just stay in the home and not work. Now, women, of course, should do the work in the home and have a job. But also that gay people has become more sort of socially acceptable generally over the last decades, but only if they are, a monogamous gay couple who want to get married and want to adopt children and actually want to fit right back into the idea of a nuclear family. And historically what you see is that elements of the LGBT movement that want to try and do that, want to sort of prove how respectable they are and prove that they're not a threat to the ruling class, then throw under the bus any element of the LGBT movement that is sort of less palatable to the ruling class. And I think, well, personally, I don't want to convince the ruling class they're not a threat. I think we want to be a threat. I think we want liberation for everyone in dismantling the system. And I think it's crucial to say that I'm not interested in fighting to be exploited equally. I think we're all part of a fight, like a fight for a better world, which is not just for trans people, but actually breaking down those boxes that specifically harm trans people, but also harm everyone in our society, that we can fight for a different type of world. So hopefully I've made it a little bit clear that sort of reformism and saying that actually we can just sort of stretch the boxes and we can fit back in is not actually going to offer liberation for everyone. And I think you can also see that when things then get hard, the ruling class will sacrifice the most oppressed in society. It becomes less of a priority to keep the gay people on side because their priority is always going to lie with the interests of the ruling class, right? So then the question of how can we fight for that? I think crucially, we should be incredibly excited about the protests that have happened. I think it is a massive thing that thousands of people have come out onto the streets, and we have to engage in that. We need to be on those protests, we need to be joining in. We also have to fight for more. We have to fight for more protests and more meetings and to keep trying to build that movement. I think in trying to do that, obviously questions will be brought up about what is the type of movement we're trying to organise and how are the best ways to organise. I think that one idea that can be particularly dominant within the LGBT movement is that LGBT people have to look after ourselves. I think this is especially strong within the trans movement specifically, and basically that cis people or straight people are too dangerous and can't be trusted, and actually we need to sort of retreat and create our own safe spaces and create our own mutual aid networks to look after each other. And I think it's fairly obvious to see why that is an appealing idea, and I definitely empathize with the sentiment. But politically, in terms of organizationally, what can we achieve, I think it is an incredibly limited perspective. We cannot actually separate ourselves off from the rest of society, even if we would like to. And actually what we have to do is link with wider struggles to be able to pose a real challenge to the system. I think even sort of the concept of allies can often be very flawed. I don't want cisgender people standing on the sidelines cheering me on. I want solidarity where we all fight together. And I think, crucially, we shouldn't give in to the idea that most people are transphobic. I think we shouldn't write off the majority of society just because a newspaper tells us that people are happy about the Supreme Court ruling. I think we need to realize that in response to this ruling, there has been, massive amounts of anger, and people are angry. And I think, when we start to have these fights on all various sorts of issues, is that people realize that you do actually have a lot more in common with the people around you on the streets than you do with someone in Parliament, right? I think we cannot organise entirely based on identity, and I think there are lots of examples you could give. But for example, like Sarah Everard was murdered by the Metropolitan Police, and at the time the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police was a lesbian. I don't think that helped. I don't think she was on our side, right? If you look at Rishi Sunak or Kemi Badenoch pushing absolutely vile racism, and I think it's not to say that those people won't have faced discrimination in their lives, because I'm absolutely certain that they have. But what decisions they make based on the position they have in society is actually that they are always going to choose the interests of the ruling class over the interests of ordinary people. And so that's why I think it's really crucial that we actually look to unite with the working class, right? We have to look to unite with the ordinary people. And I think we have to also be clear. I think sometimes socialists can pitch the idea of uniting with the working class, and it can come across as if what you're saying is that you have to pander to the most reactionary elements of the working class. And I think actually it's crucial that our politics is that we are uncompromising, is that the people we want to unite with are not the ruling class, but we're not going to sort of, hide our politics or hide our position. We're going to fight for the working class to take up all of these issues together. I think a really good example of that is the fight for abortion rights in Britain, and actually the trade union movement taking up that issue and realizing that it is an issue that is in the interest of the entirety of the working class to fight for things like abortion rights, much more than it would unite, a rich ruling class woman who realistically could get an abortion even if it was illegal. And I think that's a really clear example, and I think it's a really exciting feature of the recent demonstrations is the level of trade union support. I think the fact that various unions backed the demonstration in London, but also that on massive amounts of the local demonstrations, various branches in those areas went and brought banners and supported the trans rights process. And I think in light of that, and in light of the latest guidance, I think shows that actually workplaces are going to be a key battleground for the tone for trans rights in this country, for whether these policies get enacted, whether there is a fight back, that those arguments and those fights will be happening in workplaces, and we have to fight for trade unions to stand up and defend trans rights and say, actually, we'll not go backwards, actually, we are going to stand for trans people. So we have to, I think, fight internally for the trade unions to take good positions on those issues, but also to take up the fight in their workplaces. And we also have to fight for the trade union movement to bring that politics into the streets, engage with the wider trans movement. I think, the banners that we've seen so far have been excellent, but I think we need to see far more banners, and I think we need to see far more people behind them as well, right? I think it is a difficult challenge, but I think there is a massive opportunity in the energy and the anger around this issue, that people who have an understanding of the class politics involved, actually we have a lot to offer to the trans movement, and I think we have to go out there and try and fight for it. So I think that overall, this is a horrific situation, I think that the context that has brought this about is obviously terrible, but I also think that there's an incredibly exciting opportunity. I think the fact that there are thousands of people on the streets, thousands of people who are angry about this, who are ready to do something, and I think that it is our task as socialists to go out there and get involved and fight to keep building that movement, to deepen its base in the trade unions. And yeah, I think this is a massive opportunity for us to really create a trans rights movement and shape the conversation in the country.